Good afternoon. I'm Vivian Gadsden and president of the American Educational Research Association, and I must say it gives me enormous pleasure and it's a great honor to be able to introduce our distinguished lecturer for this 2017 meeting, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. That's all the applause. Dr. Lawrence Lightfoot is a MacArthur Prize-winning sociologist and is the Emily Hargroves Fisher Professor of Education at Harvard University, where she has been on the faculty since 1972. She's an educator, researcher, author, and public intellectual. Professor Lawrence Lightfoot has written 11 books: Worlds Apart, Relationships Between Families and Schools, and I have to say, this book was really instrumental in my making a decision to focus on families and parents, so thank you. Also, she wrote Beyond Bias, Perspectives on Classrooms with Jean Carew, and The Good High School, Portraits of Character and Culture, which received the 1984 Outstanding Book Award from the American Educational Research Association. How wise of AERA. Her book, Balm and Gilead, Journey of a Healer, which won the 1988 Christopher Award, given for literary merit and humanitarian achievement, was followed by I've Known Rivers, Lives of Loss and Liberation in 1994, and The Art and Science of Portraiture in 1997 with Jessica Hoffman Davis, and really was an instrumental piece of work in rethinking how we do what we call methodology. That book documents her pioneering approach to social science methodology, one that bridges the realms of aesthetics and empiricism. In Respect and Exploration, Professor Lawrence Lightfoot reaches deep into human experience to find the essence of this powerful quality. The Essential Conversation, what parents and teachers can learn from each other, captures the crucial exchange between parents and teachers, a dialogue that is both mirror and metaphor for the cultural forces that shape the socialization of children. And the third chapter, Risk, Passion, and Adventure in the 25 years ahead, after 50, explores, maybe it's before 50 in my case, okay, in my dreams, explores new learning during one of the most transformative and generative times in our lives. In Exit, the endings that set us free, she trains her lens on the myriad exits, ordinary and extraordinary, painful and liberating, that we make in our life journeys. Her new book, Growing Up Each Other, When Our Children Become Our Teachers, was published in the fall of 2016, and it is published by the University of Chicago Press, and you can pick it up downstairs. Okay. You know, I have a long bio here, but you're not here because you don't know who Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot is. You're here because you do know. And so I just want to say that Professor Lawrence Lightfoot has been a model of intellectual excellence, scholarship, and a deep sense of humanity. And so I am so pleased that she showed up here, and she says she did it for me, and I owe her big, okay? But I know that the message that she will impart will be something that we will remember for years to come, and that will be a dynamic part of this 2017 meeting. So let's welcome Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot.
Thank you for coming. And I'm looking out and seeing so many people as if my life is passing me by. And I'm so glad you came, and those people who I don't know, I'm glad you came as well. We live in perilous times, times where educators have a particular responsibility times that demand our engagement, our courage, our rigor, and our imaginations. It is, in fact, impossible for us to have any conversation that refers to child rearing, teaching and learning, or educational opportunity, access, and outcomes. Any conversation that speaks about the human condition without our minds being flooded by the bloody images that seem to be unleashed with great force when the planes hit the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan on September 11, 2001. A date now etched in all of our hearts. Perhaps it was the experience of the violence and the tragedy on our own soil, touching people who could be our brothers and sisters, our neighbors and friends. Perhaps it was the unfamiliar experience of being the physical targets of foreign fire that awakened in us a new and unwelcome awareness of the accumulating atrocities across our country and around our world. Since 9/11, we have seen the bloodshed up close, multiplied 100-fold by the 24/7 media coverage and amplified by the vast web of social media. We are racked by the carnage, by the murders of innocent mothers and children in Afghanistan, by the brutal bombings and attacks in Israel and Palestine, and the volatile border conflicts between India and Pakistan, by the genocide and raping of women and girls in the Sudan, by the oppression and massacre of hundreds of thousands of people in Tibet, by the uncovering of rampant pedophilia by priests and bishops of the Catholic Church, by the devastating flooding of the Gulf Coast and the obscenely inept response of federal, state, and local governments who for years ignored all warnings of danger, by the Wall Street crash following the unleashed greed, deceit, and corruption by a whole host of corporate giants, underscoring the vast abyss between the privileged few at the top and the marginalized many at the bottom. And more recently, by the brutal beheadings of brave journalists at the hands of ISIS and the terrorist attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, by the abduction, rapes, and selling of young women and girls in northern Nigeria, by the open hunting season on unarmed young black men, the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and a parade of others, stand as symbols of the terror all of us black mothers feel as our sons walk out the door on any ordinary afternoon. By the ambush and carnage of 9 black worshipers in a mother church in Charleston, by the open carry gun laws in Texas, by the mass slaughters in Syria, by the sexual assaults on college campuses, in the military, and among players in the National Football League, where the institutional responses have been mostly opaque, inadequate, and irresponsible. By the ugly, mean-spirited, and relentless presidential campaign season, filled with obscenities, phobias, and lies, bereft of content and moral anchoring, and by the surprising results that has left our country and our world in the throes of anguish and uncertainty. The symbolism and reality of each of these assaults, taken individually and collectively, make us feel helpless, vulnerable, and victimized. Our tears express our deepest anguish, fears, confusion, and rage. Our democratic values and civil rights seem to be crumbling around us as we work to find our spiritual and moral anchor. In our adult confusion and impotence, we struggle with finding the right words to support and guide our children and our students. During these long years of acute anxiety about our fragile and troubled world, we educators, our society's public adults, have felt a particular challenge and responsibility to take care of the young people in our charge, to help them to come to terms with these awful, cruel events and their aftermath, to find a precarious balance between mourning and moving on, between revenge and reconciliation, between grieving and getting busy. This afternoon, in the spirit of our AERA conference theme, Knowledge to Action, I want to address my comments to researchers and practitioners, scholars and activists, and to those who sit on the boundary lines between these domains, and to all of us who are focused on achieving the promise of equal educational opportunity. But this afternoon, rather than being consumed by the darkness, I want to pivot towards the light. I want to frame our continuing and deepening work as educational researchers and practitioners as a project of inspired creativity, a deep gesture of nuanced counterpoint, by offering 3 challenges to the prevailing language, metaphors, and images that tend to dominate the public dialogues about education and schooling. I fear that as our society and our schools have become increasingly diverse, as the distance between rich and poor continues to widen, the definitions of achievement have grown narrower and more exclusive. At a time when educational cultures need to reflect the plurality of voices, stories, and cultural narratives, a variety of intelligences and identities, and a spirit of inquiry, criticism, and adventure, many researchers, educators, and policymakers have retreated to a view of achievement that is narrow and monolithic. How might we help to create school cultures, from early childhood classrooms through graduate school training, that forge the connections between excellence and equity, learning and justice, disciplined inquiry, and truth-telling? I want to make 3 modest, ambitious, and intertwined suggestions, all beginning with V. The first has to do with reframing our view. The second centers on the need to lift up our voices. And the third expresses an imperative that everyone in our schools, every child, every student, every teacher, feel seen and known, that everyone be visible. 3 V's: view, voice, and visibility. I'm hoping you can hold these in your head and your heart. View, voice, and visibility. I refer to these V's as liberating frames because I believe that each offers a perspective that challenges the habits and rhetoric, the hopelessness and inaction that too often dominate educational discourses, particularly those discourses that focus on the tangled ideation and seemingly intractable barriers to educational equality. So the first V, reframing our view on goodness. Social scientists have a long legacy of focusing their investigations on pathology and disease rather than health and resilience. Their stance has traditionally been one of studying down, investigating and probing the lives of people who are other, people who are poor and colored, people who are undereducated and marginalized. Sitting on their distant academic perch, these scholars of what one of my colleagues calls imperial social science often confuse difference with deviance or difference with dysfunction, conflating illness and identity. This intellectual habit is magnified in research on schooling, where investigators have been much more vigilant in documenting failure than they have been in describing examples of success. To some extent, the focus on pathology is understandable, often strategic, maybe even laudable. If we identify the roots of the disease, we may be able to find a cure. Admittedly, in some recent social science scholarship, we have seen some changes in perspective and perch, with researchers honoring difference and variation and documenting strength and resilience in communities once maligned and diminished, but their voices of counterpoint do not represent the norm. I believe the relentless scrutiny of failure that continues to dominate our educational discourses has many distorting results. First, we begin to get a view of our schools and the communities they serve that magnifies what is wrong and neglects evidence of promise and potential. We create a narrative that describes an educational system in steady decline. Second, this focus on failure and pathology can often lead to despair, a nagging cynicism, and inaction. Why should we pour our energy and resources into seeking to remedy problems that are resistant to change and improvement? And why should we continue to suffer our own feelings of inadequacy, our own narcissistic injuries, when our efforts seem to make little difference? If things are really that bad and there is no hope for change, then why should we even try to do anything to remedy them? Third, the documentation of pathology often bleeds into blaming the victim. It lands heavily on the shoulders of those who are the most oppressed and disenfranchised, those who do not have access to the halls of power and decision-making, those who have no voice or visibility in the public debates about their fate. I believe that those of us who are committed to improving schools then must, of course, admit the huge challenges we all face in making them productive and nurturing environments. We must shake our fists and raise our voices in opposition to the pervasive inequalities and injustices. Our resistance and rage show we care. And we must translate our outrage into sustained commitment, rigorous research, strategic action, and determined advocacy. But we must also search out the goodness in educational settings. If we begin by asking the question, what is good here? What is working well? What is strong? What is worthy? We will discover a different reality. We may even uncover a lever of change, a spark of promise that had been formerly obscured by our well-worn negative prophecies. By goodness, I do not mean that we should romanticize or idealize the work of educators or mask their flaws and imperfections, or that we should ignore the powerful systemic and structural forces that impede productive educational reform. Rather, we need to use a lens that is both generous and discerning, both tough and forgiving. We must develop a way of seeing the inevitable two-ness of life, the fundamental dualisms, the in-between spaces that are threaded through life experiences, the beautiful ugly, nasty nice ambiguities, the resilience amidst the suffering, the agency that resists the victimization. We must adopt a perspective that admits the inevitable weaknesses and vulnerabilities embedded in any good enterprise. And when we find goodness in all of its fullness and complexity, we must invent ways of documenting it so that the principles and lessons of goodness might be reinterpreted and embedded in other places. I remember the impulse I had almost 35 years ago when I designed a piece of research with the intention of helping to change the tone and tenor of the conversation about our nation's high schools, a conversation that had grown cynical and complaining, narrow and judgmental, a conversation that felt self-defeating in its fatalism. In April of 1983, A Nation at Risk, a report from the National Commission on Excellence in Education, was published with great fanfare and clamorous uproar. The report's soundbite conclusions quickly became absorbed and imprinted on a public looking to blame schools for what they saw as their chronic failure in educating and socializing our young. There were certainly a lot of things cited in the report that deserved critique and scrutiny. The alarming proportion of students who were graduating from high schools illiterate, the rampant problems of authority and discipline in schools, the lack of coherence and rigor in the curriculum, the widening gap of resources, opportunity, and achievement between rich and poor communities. But the report piled on in a way that was blanket and dismissive, claiming to offer an objective and measured appraisal of public schooling in America. The Nation at Risk was, on close inspection, actually filled with accusation and vitriol, insisting that schools were solely at fault for the state of our deteriorating society, and saddling schools with the primary responsibility for rebuilding a healthy, wholesome democracy. But more troubling than the vitriol, I believe, was the nostalgia that reeked through the pages of the document, a nostalgia that idealized the American past and rendered the contemporary scene grotesque by contrast. Looking through rose-colored glasses, The Nation at Risk painted a picture of a time in our history when families were stable and children were good and respectful, when teachers were devoted and communities revered them. It was a view of our past shadowed by a history of amnesia, a distortion of an American past that has actually never been stable or peaceful, a history that has always been chronically fragmented and changing, a history in which each generation laments the deteriorating values and irresponsible behaviors of the next one. Against this backdrop of ahistoricism, accusation, and disappointment, and the always persistent social scientific preoccupation with pathology, in my book, The Good High School, I hoped to offer a counterpoint and challenge to the monotone of negativism. For 3 years, I traveled around the country documenting the character and culture of 6 high schools, 2 urban schools in poor communities, 2 affluent suburban schools, and 2 elite preparatory academies that express their goodness in very different ways, seeking to understand the sources of their stability and resilience, the arc of their institutional growth, and hoping to uncover the threats of inertia and resistance that compromised their brave efforts. In searching for the good, I was eager to hear the voices and insights, the perspectives and experiences of the school's inhabitants, not the distant appraisals of researchers or experts. And I wanted to produce a document that was informative and inspiring to educators, a portrayal of their lives and work with which they could feel identified, challenged, and implicated. My own methodological invention of portraiture, a bridging of empiricism and aesthetics, has been a purposeful effort to document goodness and to spread the good news. It has been a quest for something missing from a good deal of scholarship in the social sciences that is steeped in positivist impulses and protocols. A quest blending science and art, expressivity and restraint, a quest full of listening and witness, listening to the sound of a human voice making sense of other human voices, especially those that have been silenced and not heard. Tracing the line of the story set in a historical context, placing the actors in a long-running moral and political drama, producing a text that reveals the eclecticism of method and material, a narrative that reaches out to broad and diverse audiences in language that hopes to be accessible and evocative, that seeks to inform, inspire, and provoke thought and action, that speaks to the heart and the head, and in the end, hoping to build a broader community of participants who might become more fully engaged in efforts to improve the educational project. The second V, are you with me? Yes. Good. The second V, lifting up our voices on discourse. This more generous and forgiving vision, this probing for goodness, is related to my second theme, which challenges the tone, dynamics, and language of the public discourse about education. Too much of the conversation about schools is reductionistic and rhetorical, driven by ideology rather than insight, and pitched to advantage particular constituencies of powerful adults rather than for the benefit of all children. It is an unruly discourse resonating with the voices of researchers and policymakers whose perspectives are often distant from the realities of life in schools. The voices of policy folks tend to be combative and expedient, while the voices of researchers too often seem opaque and remote. I am urging the development and amplification of voices that bridge the great divide between theory and practice, that take advantage of the different perspectives of researchers and practitioners, that recognize the richness of the counterpoint that gets produced when disciplined inquiry is grounded in and shaped and constrained by the social and historical context. This means, of course, that we need to dismantle the hierarchy between the thinkers and the doers, the intellectuals and the activists, and create a symmetry of voices that values each perspective. We must listen, for example, to the intimate knowledge of teachers, a knowledge that grows out of subjectivity, intuition, direct experience, and deep reflection, a knowledge that is forged out of autobiographical roots, developmental history, and personal perspective, a knowledge that is often best captured in images, metaphors, and vivid storytelling. And let us not forget the wise, authoritative, and critical voices of students, so often silenced in the discourse, so attentive to the adult hypocrisies and contradictions, so ready to teach us about the beat of contemporary culture. At the same time, we must honor the intelligence and insights of researchers whose stance must be vigilantly counterintuitive, skeptical, and enough distant from the action to be able to see patterns and trends. We must be ready to reckon with the researchers' evidence that surprises us, challenging our long-held presumptions and prejudices. I believe that the public debates around education will only be fully productive when we listen for and honor all of these voices, and when, by creating this great cacophony, we begin to speak to larger, more eclectic audiences. Rather than a dialogue informed by expediency and ideology, we will be able to develop a language that is understandable, not exclusive or esoteric, a language that encourages more people to join in the conversation, provokes debate, and invites reflection and action. Joseph Featherstone, social historian, Dewey scholar, and engaged educator, traces the connection between the intimate storytelling of practitioners and the public discourse that researchers hope to impact, and draws the continuum between analysis on the one end and solidarity on the other. What he calls a people's scholarship is rooted in explicitly humanistic values, honors the intertwined truths of analysis and solidarity, and can, Featherstone claims, be traced back to the great works of William James and W.E.B. Du Bois. It is a scholarship that embraces both analytic rigor, offering a perch and perspective that is intentionally discerning, rigorous, data-filled, and distant, and community building, nourishing connections of trust and intimacy with the people we are studying and seeking to understand. It is, says Featherstone, in quest of the power that comes from looking beyond the isolation at the little difference there is between humans and the supreme importance of that difference. It searches for the energizing shock of sympathy and of human community, end quote. In Souls of Black Folk, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois was at work on the problem of human blindness, linking the public existence of the Negro to the inner world behind the veil, and offering a new kind of scholarship in which scientific facts gathered in the field would give voice to a people's existence. He was the quintessential boundary crosser. Everything was grist for Du Bois's mill, from autobiography to history, from politics to journalism to psychology, from fiction to poetry to spirituality. In constructing a rich text of objectivity and advocacy, Du Bois unmasked and interrogated the negative white images of the lives of Black folk. This slender and powerful volume, Du Bois is best known, became a kind of scholarly poem, a drawing and opening for Blacks, a potential vantage point for envisioning a different American culture. And interestingly, an unforgettable autobiography. Du Bois sketching himself as a teacher in a rural black school. Thank you. So I hope that we, in our scholarship and practice, will disrupt the discourse and reframe the conversation, that we will resist the hierarchies of power and language that get in the way of authentic and inclusive representations of a humanistic education, and that we will challenge the disciplinary boundaries and theoretical grids that inhibit our tackling of the knotty, nuanced questions that resist easy measurement. I hope that our public and private discourses will embrace the dialectic between analysis and solidarity and create the moral and social spaces for our imaginations to soar. What a gift. Agua. Thank you. The third V, making everyone visible on diversity. A real solidarity rooted in intimacy and connection grows out of authentic inclusivity, not clannishness. My third theme expresses my belief that diversity, variety, and contrast are central ingredients of educational goodness. Education must not be seen as a monolithic experience. It must honor the differences in culture, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, even as it searches for universal values. Students and teachers should be challenged to consider alternative ways of being, different ways of thinking, and contrasting value systems. This, of course, means more than counting bodies. The numbers of Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asians on the faculty or in the student body. A body count that no longer makes sense when so many of the bodies refuse to accept the social constructs that do not represent them or mirror their identities. It means more than scheduling rituals and celebrations to honor high holy days or revered cultural heroes. And it means more than making sure that every cultural or religious group gets visibly reflected in the curriculum. The real challenges of diversity are subtle and complex. Their very subtlety is menacing. These challenges reside in the substance and texture of discourse, in the feelings of engagement embedded in teaching and learning, in seeking to create an environment in which no one will have to endure the distortions of tokenism or feel responsible for representing a monolithic group, where people will feel safe in expressing opposing views and will learn to risk discomfort and vulnerability on the way to genuine understanding. The enactment of diversity is tremendously important as our country grows increasingly multicultural and as our world becomes smaller and smaller. When boundaries are erased and home is no longer geographically circumscribed. But instead of embracing the rich variation around us, I see a tendency towards clannishness that has reached a deafening crescendo in the last 100 days. And us against them, subtlety. And us against them mentality, a ridiculously unfair combat between the 99% and the 1%. I see a retreat from the social commitments we fought so hard for in the last few decades that troubles and terrifies me. I see it in city schools where middle-class abandonment has left our schools poor and colored. I see it in the masked messages and subtext hiding behind our policy and research discourses about achievement and opportunity gaps, standards and standardization, accountability and regulation. I see it in the wasteful wars between charter school advocates and public school defenders. I see it in the residential segregation and the gated communities that symbolize exclusion and hierarchy, in the immigration wars and the literal and symbolic walls that we erect between outsiders and insiders. I see it in the dismantling of affirmative action programs in colleges and universities and a Supreme Court willing to reconsider their legitimacy. I see it in who gets trapped on the other side of the digital divide. In this climate of prejudice and exclusivity, we who claim to welcome diversity in all of its varied manifestations will have to fight for this worldview in the educational institutions we attend, in the communities we inhabit, in the scholarly enclaves where we work, in the research questions and methodologies that we design. We will have to argue that pluralism brings a richness, a colorfulness, and a vitality that closed communities can never know. We will have to convince others that places that exclude are impoverished places, that inhibit the full range of learning, growth, and discovery. Diversity and authentic inclusivity, I believe, are primarily about visibility. Visibility is not about overexposure, not about being identified as the exception, not about standing apart or standing above, and not about representing the race. Rather, visibility is about everyone feeling seen, everyone feeling acknowledged, and everyone being seen as worthy. I will never forget one morning when my now 35-year-old daughter, Talani, was about 4. She woke up singing her version of Stevie Wonder's soulful anthem, "You Are So Beautiful to Me." Transposing the words and refocusing the light, Talani crooned her sweet little girl rendition. I am so beautiful to you. She sang as she spread her arms wide and embraced the world around her. Yes, Talani, yes. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and those eyes are more likely to see beauty if they belong to a person who herself feels beautiful. To see and feel beauty, we must be visible. Visibility, of course, is the opposite of invisibility. In the always painful opening paragraphs of Ralph Ellison's classic book, Invisible Man, published more than half a century ago, the protagonist's words resonate with the emptiness and humiliation of being unnoticed and unseen. I quote from his opening passage, "I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fibers and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me." End quote. The plight of Ellison's Invisible Man echoes in our lives today. Our images continue to be distorted by what Ellison describes as the construction of their inner eyes. The prejudice of invisibility still lingers on. Ralph Ellison's notion of the construction of their inner eyes speaks to researchers, I believe, with particular poignancy. It provokes us to ask ourselves, what might get in the way of our seeing others, whose lives we are documenting, whose minds we are mining and measuring, whose beliefs we are interpreting with fullness and clarity, unencumbered by the shadows of bias, prejudice, ignorance, and fear. How can we cut through the layers of hard, distorted glass and see the full humanity of our research subjects, participants, protagonists? How can we use our methods and our metrics, our concepts and our theories, our analyses and our insights to illuminate rather than obscure the visibility of their lives? We can start, I believe, by interrogating the autobiographical roots and impulses and the intellectual preoccupations and curiosities that motivate and shape our own research. We can puncture and complicate our scholarly claims of objectivity, a mask we wear that too often impedes our efforts to join empathy and empiricism, sympathy and skepticism, analysis and solidarity. A mask that ultimately hides our visibility, mutes our voices, and hinders our efforts to develop symmetric relationships of respect and trust with those we are studying and with our partners in the struggle for educational equality. Was that clear? Good. Because if it wasn't, I'll read it again. I worked very hard on that sentence. To be visible, we must live lives of vigilant observation, criticism, and action. To be seen, we must see. Observation and criticism must become daily habits of our lives as educators, as practitioners and researchers, as advocates and analysts, as we test the moral threads of our society, as we rage against and study the roots of powerlessness, violence, and oppression in Ferguson, Missouri, in New Orleans, in Charleston, South Carolina, in Cincinnati, in Paris, in Los Angeles, in Gaza, in the Ukraine, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in the Sudan, in Syria, in Nigeria, in North Korea, as we support fairness and justice everywhere. Goodness in education means learning to risk visibility. It means learning to bear public witness. My words this afternoon, and thank you for listening in the way you are. I've been so powerful that I've broken my beautiful necklace. The chains on my beautiful necklace. Safely brought back from Vietnam 2 weeks ago, so I'll fix it. My words this afternoon sound serious and weighty as I urge us to complicate and broaden our view of educational goodness, as I urge us to honor and acknowledge the perspective and voices of researchers and advocates, teachers and students, and develop a broader, more inclusive conversation, one that builds the bridges between knowledge and action. As I urge us to see diversity as a strength and work towards its realization in the institutions and communities we inhabit. As I urge us to make ourselves and others visible, bearing witness and speaking out. To some extent, these are all countercultural admonitions, ways of being and seeing, engaging and enacting that will be difficult to sustain in a society filled with conflicting tendencies. They will require disrupting the discourse and reframing the conversation. There will be conflict and dissent as we go forth and engage the struggle, confronting the institutional structures that inhibit access, challenging the stereotypes and discrimination that render too many people voiceless and invisible, scrutinizing the cultural priorities that reinforce fierce competition and the harsh paradigm of winning and losing, and exposing the historical narratives that haunt our contemporary efforts to build a democratic nation. This is big work. This is intellectually discerning and methodologically rigorous work. This is ethical and relational work. This is passionate, soulful work. And this is work that we must do together, with optimism, with hope, with respect, with restraint and intentionality, with grit and with grace. I want to close with an autobiographical allusion that gestures towards themes that have motivated my scholarship for the last 4 decades, and that echoes with the challenges and commitments suggested by the 3 liberating frames of view, voice, and visibility. I feel haunted this afternoon as I stand before you by the ghosts of my early education, especially the part of my schooling marked by the scars of racism and the distortions of tokenism. Here is one ancient school memory that has been dogging and inspiring me recently. A beautiful, ugly fragment from my 5th grade at South Main Street School in Spring Valley, New York. It was Negro History Week, and Mr. Miller, my earnest teacher, was doing his best to honor the heritage of the one Negro child in his class by having us all read the work of, as he put it, one colored poet. The poet's name was Jean Toomer. I vividly recall the quiet stares of my classmates watching how I responded to being singled out. But my deeper recollection, a surprising and welcome unintended consequence, was that as we recited Toomer's verse, I learned for the first time the power and meaning of metaphor. Here is Toomer's poem. The Mississippi, sister of the Ganges, main artery of earth in the Western world, is waiting to become, in the spirit of America, a sacred river. Whoever lifts the Mississippi lifts himself and all America. Whoever lifts himself makes the great brown river smile. So as I look out at you beautiful people, you are so beautiful to me. I wanted to be the first one to sing at ARA. I'm coming to the serious conclusion. So as I look out at you beautiful people, you are so beautiful to me. I want to celebrate the struggle. I want to honor the dissonance. I want us to listen for the metaphors and not miss the unintended consequences. But mostly, I want to urge us to get busy. Together, let's make the great brown river smile. Thank you very much.